So sometimes people ask the question, what made you write Blackamoores? What was in it? What caused that to happen? The answer is that I had to write it. I was forced into it. I didn't have a choice. It's like if somebody says to you, why do you get up in the morning? And you answer, well, I have to get up in the morning, otherwise I don't live. Same reason. That book was written because I had to. The voices of those Africans who lived in this country at that time, 1485 to the 17th century, are voices of people that were distantly ignored, separated from the reality of this reality, and the idea was purported that they didn't exist and their voices didn't exist. Those voices were of real people and their existence was real, and they had been speaking to me before I knew evidence of their existence, probably for the last 32 to 33 years. At least that period of time, perhaps slightly before that, perhaps 34, but certainly the last 32 years. Those voices have been continuous. And it began when, for example, in secondary school, in college, when I would read about English history, British history. It began when I would look at Shakespeare and read those voices and hear other voices ancillary to those voices, which are not contained in the text, but were nevertheless speaking. And the question that always came to me, was the voice that I was hearing an authentic voice? Or is there another voice? And it's a feeling. I would go to certain places and you feel something in those places. These aren't places that have been said to you are places where African people now reside, but you would feel something that you're unable to explain about the place that you're in, some kind of spiritual connection. And you might put that down to a personal thing or something beyond. I put it down to a personal thing and something beyond that. So, for example, I was always spiritually attracted to places like Plymouth and Bristol and other places like that. Plymouth is not known for being a place that has a strong African presence. Now, it does in the past, but now it's not thought of as one of those places. But I had a strong spiritual connection to Plymouth. I had a strong spiritual connection to certain towns and cities in Devon and Cornwall. And yet it wasn't said that those are places where people of African descent resided. Had a strong spiritual connection to the Butolph without Aldgate area, that area around Stepney. And Bethnal Green, which isn't a place now where people of African descent are thought of as being strongly resident. And yet I had a strong spiritual connection to those places. To Bankside in Southwark, just over the River Thames, and also St Olave and Hart Street, also in central London, has strong connections to those places. So as a young person, trying to make sense of reality, one doesn't know quite why one has those connections. Is it a past life? Is it something within your own spiritual DNA? Is it something personal? I acknowledged that it was something more than personal, but something public, but didn't have the evidence to support that. So then beyond what was being said, I had a feeling that what was being said wasn't correct. Because of the history of this country is bound up not in history, but in it's a political tool. People don't learn history in this country. They don't learn the history of this country. It doesn't matter what color you are, you don't learn the history of this country. What you learn is a political statement about this country, which is rooted in a Victorian kind of colonial imperialism, passed down as history, a romantic fiction, a Merchant Ivory style vision of Britain, which is a mono-ethnic, religious and masculine perspective of the world. It's a world in which people of African descent didn't exist, people of Asian descent didn't exist, people that were non-Christian didn't exist. It's even a world in which women, except for a few queens, didn't exist. It's a world in which everybody is heterosexual in this country, and it's not true. And all of that history is omitted. So it's a history in which only the rich people and only the powerful people reside. Poor people don't reside in the past somehow. And yet we know that all of that's untrue. We know that there were poor people that lived in this country and they had a large impact on the very nature of this history. We know that people of African and Asian descent shaped this country, this society. And we know that other religions have had a major impact on the development of the society. And no matter how much people may talk about the heterosexuality, nature of sexual aspect of this society, we know that other people of other sexual orientations have also played a part in the development and shaping of this country. So there is an acknowledgement, however, that all the other fields of history, women's history, gender history, the history of sexuality, history of class, etc., are important parts that need to be rediscovered, and they can be rediscovered without a polemic title attached to them. But black history, the teaching of African history, is the only type of history out of all those types of history that isn't thought of as being worthy of a subject that can be taught without it being polemic. So if you're going to teach gender, women's history, is acknowledged, okay, yes, that's a field of study, fine. We know that the gender question is a question that needs to be addressed in this society. Class history, yeah, we acknowledge that class history is something that needs to be discussed in this country. But when you start talking about African history in Britain, then suddenly, oh, that's polemic. Oh, that's reverse racism. Oh, that's blah, 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 blah. It's political correctness gone mad. The other types are acknowledged. This is a mistake. So in the same way that we can justify those other types of history, we also must justify, perhaps even more so, the history of African people in this country as part and parcel of actually teaching history correctly. So if we teach history correctly, the history of this country, we cannot help but include Africans. That's it. So we are about actually teaching history correctly. Has to be inclusive by definition, because otherwise, if it's not inclusive, then it's not the teaching of history. Africanus.